And now I'm talking to James O'Brien from VSO Ireland. James, how's it going? James, VSO launched a report last week called Valuing Volunteering. I think it was launched at the Mansion House. Could you just give us the what's kind of background to it, please?
Yeah, sure. VSO is an international development organisation that works through volunteers. We've been up and running in Ireland for the last 11 years, and what we do here is we recruit Irish people, a lot of teachers and medical professionals and a mix of others, to go work on our programmes in Africa, Asia and the Pacific. We began the Valuing Volunteering programme 4 years ago. At that stage, and even today, there had been a lot of research done on the impact that volunteering, especially international volunteering, has on the volunteer themselves, but not a huge body of research, and no real major research had been done on the impact that volunteers have on poverty reduction and on creating sustainable change in the communities that we work in. So that was sort of where the Valuing Volunteering research came from. It's been carried out over the last 2 years in 4 countries. By 4 VSO volunteers who are doing this as volunteers. So they've been in Ghana, in Mozambique, in the Philippines and in Nepal. And like you said, we finished up the research recently, and we had the launch of it in Dublin in the Mansion House last Tuesday.
Yeah, I was looking at a kind of summary of the report and looking at the headings, and there was an article on the journal.ie about it, wasn't there? And it's a really comprehensive report, and but what's good about it is I didn't read the whole report now on the time, but it's easy to read, and the results of it make sense. They just really make sense, but you actually need somebody to carry out the research to kind of be able to cover that. Isn't that right the way it is?
Yeah, that really sums it up very well. I think for us, one part of my job is that I debrief return volunteers when they come home. So there are a lot of things that came through in the report that for me, I think for the organisation as well, that we would have sort of anecdotally picked up these insights from volunteers who have been overseas for a year or two. But it was only really through the research and through that action research methodology that was used in those 4 countries, and that we got to really understand the mechanics of just how it is that volunteers have an impact in the communities that they're working with. And also it has certain consequences for us as an organisation that work through volunteers in terms of how we work in the future. I should say as well that it looked very broadly at volunteering. So what we do in Ireland is we send volunteers overseas in VSO, but most of the world's volunteers are people who are giving their time in their own communities. They're community health workers, or they're working in education, or they're carers. And that was the focus of the research was on all forms of volunteering, from international volunteers to South-South volunteers. We do a lot of recruitment in Kenya and Uganda for international volunteers, and also people working in their own countries and in their own communities. And it wasn't just focused on VSO. So out of the 12 case studies that were carried out as part of the research, only 3 of those were looking at VSO volunteers. The 9 others were looking at other organisations and sort of less formal, less organisation-based forms of volunteering. So I think if you look at the research, the consequences of it are it's very important for VSO, and we were the ones who led this with the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. But I think it does have repercussions for any organisation here or overseas that works through volunteers.
Yeah, and was the report carried out by VSO? I know it was done in conjunction with I forget what they're called. Just tell me, please. And who carried it out? Was it you yourselves?
It was instigated by VSO, and we were doing it in partnership with the Institute of Development Studies, which is based in Brighton. In a university there in the UK. So we sort of came up with the initial idea for the research, and what the guys in Brighton did primarily was that they developed the methodology. So it was quite an interesting way that the volunteers were working overseas. It wasn't desk-based research, it was action research, and it was participatory. So each of the volunteers overseas was also setting up individual research groups, some of which are still going on in the countries that they were working in, testing things with volunteers, seeing how they worked, gathering information on whether they worked or not, tweaking them and testing them in sort of an iterative model. And that was something that was kind of led by the input from the Institute of Development Studies, but it was carried out by 4 volunteers who were recruited by VSO.
Yeah, and is it true that VSO use work were kind of like high caliber? I'm not sure whatever the word, high skilled people. Like you aren't looking for people like kind of building houses, like bricklayers or whatever. You're looking for people who are like have third level qualifications, or doctors, nurses, all that kind of stuff.
Generally, our volunteers need to have a third level qualification of some kind and some post qualification experience. So generally, it's at least 2 or 3 years experience. For people who don't have third level qualifications, if you have a lot of work experience behind you, and especially if you have any sort of experience of working with people from different cultures, then there's sometimes we can make exceptions. The limiting factor often is getting visas for some of the countries that we work in, but it also has to do with the way that VSO works. That, for example, when we recruit a teacher in Ireland, we don't send that teacher into the classroom to teach children or primarily to do service delivery. Generally, our teachers are working sort of one level up from that. So often they're working in teacher training colleges on improving the standard of teaching in those colleges, or they're working in ministries of education, working on curriculum or assessment, or sort of other areas that are dealt with at the ministry level. So for that reason, because the idea is that you're transferring your skills and transferring your experience and building the capacity of the people that you're working with overseas, for that reason, I guess what we look for are particularly skilled people. The other factor there is that we're very much a demand-driven organisation. So we work with 500 local partner organisations around the world, and it's only really when one of those organisations says to us, we need somebody external to come in with a particular skill set, and they generate a job description, that we then try to find somebody to fill a placement. So we're very much trying to find people to fill specific jobs with our partners overseas, rather than finding jobs to suit the people who come to apply to us.
That's amazing. 500 organisations. That's amazing.
In 23 countries now.
I was going to ask how many countries? 23 countries. Just to kind of finish up, unless you have more to say, what would be your message for people who are listening today about thinking about volunteering? Say they're qualified as a doctor, nurse, engineer. Like, what are jobs? What jobs?
There's really a wide range. About a third of our volunteers are education professionals. About a third of them are health professionals, and then that last third is a really big mix of people who've experience in business, people who might have worked for NGOs in fundraising or in monitoring and evaluation, and it's really kind of a mixed bag in that last third. So if anybody's interested in volunteering, you can go to our website, which is VSO.ie, and you can actually search, you can look at the jobs, the overseas volunteer placements that are available at the minute, and apply for individual placements. If you don't see anything there, because it might just be that there isn't a job to suit you there at the minute, but there might be in a few months' time. If you don't see anything there that suits you, you can get in touch with us. You can email info@vso.ie, or you can call the volunteering team here on 01 640 1060.
Yeah, and just do you be looking for like tradesmen as well? Like,
we do sometimes, yeah, but to do vocational training. So if you're a tradesman who has experience, for example, of having apprentices working with you, then occasionally we have placements with our overseas partners to do training, for example, in northern Uganda with young people who have lived through conflict. We have a couple of placements where we have people going over and working as vocational trainers there. Like I say, you won't be going over there and building houses, but you might be going over there and training other people on how to build houses.
And just 2 more questions. Do you work in any countries that are in conflict, like wars going on around? Like?
No, that's something sort of unique about VSO as well, that we don't tend to work in conflict environments. We were working in South Sudan before the conflict broke out the year before last, and we don't generally focus on emergency relief. What we do is we sort of take a longer term approach to development. So often we'll go in a few years after a conflict and help with health and education and livelihoods and people's participation in decision making. What we do is, if there is a conflict or if there is a natural disaster in a country that we have a knowledge of, if we have a base there, then we will engage in relief operations. So for example, at the moment in Nepal, we're recruiting doctors in particular to go and work there. But that tends to be the exception, that what we look for is a more long-term approach to development.
All right, and just to finish up, what would be your message for people listening today about they're interested in finding out more, possibly volunteering. And if you can just draw on the research report you published last week and like a couple of the findings to kind of incorporate kind of a bit of the message from that report into your answer, if you can, please.
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question.
No,
I think
that the whole thing, but you know what I mean?
yeah. I think the understanding of volunteering has really changed in recent years. It's gone from being seen as something that people do of their own free will to give something back to. That's part of it, but it's also an incredibly powerful way of doing development. And some of the things that came through from the report were that volunteers have a particular ability to extend the reach of services, health and education services, beyond what governments can do. And sometimes that can be actually extending the reach of the services, and sometimes that can just be providing information to people about what services are available to them and giving them access to services that might be available but they weren't aware of. It's also a particularly good way of I guess approaching development issues. That those partner organisations that we work with, a really common frustration with them is organisations coming in from outside with a sort of a predetermined notion of what the challenges are that face a community and what the solutions to those challenges are. So volunteering, because of the nature of volunteering, it involves living and working alongside the people that you're serving, and you gain a real insight into their lives, their challenges, and it allows you, and this is something that came through strongly in the research, to sort of co-create locally appropriate, locally owned solutions that will be more sustainable. So one of the ideas of our volunteers is that your job is to do yourself out of a job. So over the course of 6 months or a year or 2 years, you're working with a local counterpart. So by the time you come back to Ireland, the progress that you've made and the work that you've done will continue long after you've left. And that's something else that came through really strongly from this research.
Yeah, that's brilliant, James. It's great that like VSO are the leading independent organisation for volunteers in developing countries, aren't you? And like there's a lot of talk. I won't keep you. There's a lot of talk I've read in the last year or two. I've only gone into interested in the development sector in the last couple of years, but like voluntourism, like but yous aren't like people going abroad and they're really going for a holiday and they mightn't be leaving that much of a legacy or whatever. And arguably some of them aren't even needed, and the cost of their flights over would be better spent in a different way. But you aren't like that, aren't you?
No, as I say, we're more long term. Our volunteers tend to go for a longer amount of time. That's not to say that our volunteers don't have a great experience overseas, that they don't get time and they're able to travel and experience a new culture. But no, I think we do take a very different approach. I think it's something that's been more prevalent in other countries and hasn't particularly taken off. In Ireland, even at the height of the boom, there weren't that many organisations offering that sort of experience. And the other thing about that is that it can be very expensive for the volunteer, whereas with VSO, it's sort of cost neutral. We don't charge anything of our volunteers, and we cover the costs of flights and accommodation when you're in country, and we pay a local wage, so we pay an allowance to our volunteers as well. So unlike some of those sort of volunteerism companies or operators, volunteering with VSO ultimately doesn't cost the volunteer anything.
Okay, James. That's great. Could you just give us out there, people are interested, your contact details again, please?
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you're interested in volunteering, you can get in touch with me, james.o'brien@vso.ie, or the general email address is info@vso.ie. And if you just want to find out more, you can give us a call on 01 640 1060. And we're based in Dublin City Centre as well. You can find the address on our website. So if you want to call into the office and find out more, we'd be very happy to talk to you about volunteering.
Okay, James, thanks very much.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks for having me.